Hello, everyone. Welcome to the October Stay-at-Home Lecture. I'm Tim Nutt, the director of the UAMS Historical Research Center, and glad to have you here with us today. And we had a sort of we missed the last couple of, or last month, I guess, we had a cancellation. So I'm glad to have everyone back today. Move forward. As you, if you joined these before, you know that this is a stay-at-home lecture. It's sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the support organization for the Historical Research Center. And the Historical Research Center is the archives division of department of rather than of the UAMS library. And we are charged with preserving the institutional record of UAMS, as well as preserving the history of the health sciences in Arkansas. So, so that encompasses a lot of things. We have the traditional materials that an archives would have like photographs and correspondence and things like that. But then since we're the institutional repository for UAMS, we also have things like departmental reports, budgets, things like that, that would document the history of the university. And we do have materials going back to 1879, the creation of the establishment of the medical school. And then in addition, other materials dealing with physicians and organizations and other sort of auxiliary parts of the health sciences in Arkansas. We also collect materials on that. So that might also include photographs, but it also includes artifacts. So if you're ever interested in coming down and visiting with us, we'd love to have you. I'd love to show you a tour and give you show you some of the materials and holdings that we have in our collections. And if you'd like to get a hold of us, our email and phone number is on the screen there. And as I mentioned, the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions is the sponsor of the Stay-at-Home Lecture. And they support the Historical Research Center in a number of ways, including providing financial support and purchasing materials, and but also sponsoring programming and other events. So programming such as this, and then other lectures throughout the year. If you're not a member of the society, I'd love to have you as a member. The dues are inexpensive, $5 for a student, and you don't have to be a student just at UAMS. You could be a student anywhere throughout the world. Actually, individual dues are inexpensive as well, with $15 for an individual, and then you get family and patron and sustaining going up from that. If you're interested in joining, you can go to the URL, excuse me, on your screen. That'll take you to the society website, and you can fill out a form and then mail in your check, or you can just go to the paypal.me/shmhb and just pay your dues online right there. And then we also have Venmo now. If you want to do Venmo, you can just do @shmhb. And that will do it as well. So I hope you'd consider joining, but if not, we're glad you're here anyway. These stay-at-home lectures are, they occur at the first Thursday of every month from 12 to 1 p.m. And next month, we're glad to have Dr. Taylor Pruitt from Fort Smith, and he's going to be talking about a friend and a colleague of his in Fort Smith, Dr. Harry P. McDonald, who was one of the influential doctors in Fort Smith in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So I hope you'll join us for that on November 7th and hear Dr. Pruitt. Dr. Pruitt's always a good speaker, and I know he'll give a good presentation on Dr. McDonald. It will be on Zoom, as it always is, and the link will be the same one that you used to get into today's lecture, and it is on the bottom of your screen Again, if you have any issues, you can just email us at hrc@uams.edu, and I'll be glad to help you sign on. And also, if you have any suggestions for programming, I'd love to hear from you about that. So now that we've gotten one more thing before we move on, I will mention that these lectures are recorded, and after probably about a week after they happen, they're uploaded to the YouTube channel, the Society YouTube channel. So if you'd like to go and rewatch it, or if you want to send the link to someone else to watch it, they are available for viewing on YouTube, and you just go to SHMHP, Society for the History of Medicine, and you'll get the page with all the previous stay-at-home lectures on there, in addition to a few other lectures that we've had through the years. So I hope you'll check that out. Now, I'm glad to have you all here today. We're going to be talking about when the medical school moved from downtown Little Rock to what was then West Little Rock. Of course, today we're considered Midtown, where the university is. And it's an interesting story of how the medical school left downtown and moved out to the western outskirts of Little Rock. So it's a kind of a complicated story. I'm not going to be able to go into great details about it because there's so many details about it, but it's an interesting story. So let's dig in a little bit. Just to lay a little groundwork. So where the university is now on Markham, on West Markham, 4301 West Markham, this is the 5th location of the medical school. The first medical school, of course, the medical school was established in 1879, and it was a proprietary school. There were 8 owners of the school, and those 8 physicians are considered the founders of UAMS. And so in 1879, when the medical school was established, it was affiliated with the University of Arkansas, then known as Arkansas Industrial University. And the first location was downtown between Main and Louisiana Streets on 2nd. And the 8 owners purchased the old Sparandio restaurant and hotel. You see that on the screen. And the Sparandio restaurant had been built in about 1873. It remained open as a very popular restaurant for a few years, but the owner around 1875 decided he wanted to, or 1875 decided he wanted to move on. And so by the time 1879 came around, the building was sitting empty. The 8 founders purchased the building, renovated it somewhat as best they could to make it suitable for a medical school. And so the medical school opened in the old Sparandio restaurant in October of 1879. Now, that building did not have any clinical facilities for the students. In fact, there were no hospitals in Little Rock at that time, or established really permanent hospitals in Little Rock at that time. So any clinical training that the students had to do, right across the alley, you'll see the alley right next to that building. On the other side of that alley was the old Phones Brothers warehouse. And in that warehouse, they set up a sort of a little clinical training shop for the students. So wasn't ideal, but it did give the students some clinical training. So the schools remained in the Sparandio restaurant, and the former Sparandio restaurant rather, until 1890, when they outgrew their space. And they built another building just down the street. It was at 2nd and Sherman Streets in downtown Little Rock. And they moved there in 1890. And it was a 3-story building, as you can see on the screen. And the school remained in that building until 1912. And again, they had to move out because it was they just outgrew the quarters. Now, the thing about the second medical school is at that time, that's when they started this. The medical school had received an endowment from Dr. Isaac Folsom in Lone Oak, and to establish the Isaac Folsom Clinic, which they eventually did, and it was added to the back of the building. It's not in this picture, but it was at the back of this building. And then they also, the students who were in the second medical school building had the opportunity to have a clinical facility, the Logan Roots Hospital, which was located right next door to the school as well. So they had an opportunity to treat patients in the Isaac Folsom Clinic and in the Logan Roots Hospital, which were just right there next to each other, next to the medical school. In 1912, of course, they outgrew the building. They still kept this building and they used it for sort of clinical teaching a little bit, but for all the classes and everything were moved into what we now know as the Old State House. It's the War Memorial Building. Of course, the new Capitol had been built. Wasn't completely finished when the legislature moved into it in 1911, but it was done enough. It was completed enough where they could move into it. So that left the old state capitol empty. The legislature approved the measure of the medical school going in to the old state capitol, and you can see the sign in between the columns in this picture. Now, this was not an ideal location for the medical school, as you can imagine, being a government building. It was probably even more ill-suited for a medical school than a restaurant was. But they did make do with it, and they stayed in it in the old State House, still utilizing the second medical school as well, as I mentioned, for clinical training and other things like that. But they stayed in the old State House building until about 1935, when they moved into the fourth location of the medical school, which was a little bit slightly south of where the three first buildings had been, whereas the first three were around Second and Markham, all around in there by the river. The fourth one, fourth medical school, was a little further down, closer to MacArthur Park, what we now know as MacArthur Park. And then they did that because, again, the facilities just became inadequate. The old State House was just not working as a good facility for the medical school. So they built this other one in the 1930s down by City Park. Now, just to reiterate, the clinical facilities, as I mentioned, the Logan Roots Hospital was located right next door to that second medical school. And so they had this clinical or this hospital as one of their clinical training facilities. They also had the Isaac Folsom Clinic, which was an outpatient clinic that was associated with the university or the medical school. And then you also had St. Vincent Infirmary, which was located at 10th and High Streets. High is now Martin Luther King Street. And then in the 1920s, you had the establishment of the Baptist State Hospital in downtown Little Rock. So by the time that the medical school had were moving into their fourth building at 12th and McAlmont Street in downtown Little Rock, they had, even though they did not have a dedicated hospital where they could do clinical practice, they did have access to the hospitals in Little Rock, the Baptist State Hospital, St. Vincent Infirmary, and the Logan Roots Hospital. So the students were able to do their studies in the medical building or the school, and then do training in the hospitals around Little Rock. But one of the things that the administrators of the medical school wanted is they truly wanted a hospital that was affiliated with the medical school and really have a medical center rather than just a medical school, and then farming out the clinical training to the hospitals around the city. And so they started thinking about this, and even in the 1920s, they were already thinking about building a new medical school. And that that plan, even in the mid-1920s, involved a medical center where you would have an administrative building, you would have a hospital attached to the medical school that was affiliated to the school. And then you would also have the classrooms, things like that. And then you also have the Isaac Folsom Clinic, which was the outpatient clinic, and that had to be associated with the university as well. So even in the mid-1920s, when they started thinking about building a new medical school, they started thinking more of sort of a grander idea of not just a medical school and utilizing hospitals around the city, but a true sort of a campus where you would have a hospital and the school and the clinical and the educational training all together in one place. And they started looking at different locations around the city as to where this might be able to be built. Originally, they were looking at down by City Park, MacArthur Park now. That's eventually where the fourth medical school actually was built. And the reason it was built there was because the city hospital, there was a city hospital finally built in 1922, and it was built around 11th and McAlmont Streets. So when they decided to build a new medical school, they decided to locate it next to the city hospital. And so it was not exactly what they had envisioned as far as a medical center campus. But one of the things that always plagued medical school was lack of funding. Of course, in the beginning, it was strictly proprietary, so there was no money coming from the U of A. There was no money coming from the state to support the medical school. And it relied strictly on the profits and the tuition that students paid. And it wasn't until 1911, 1912, when the school was actually formally incorporated into the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville campus. And so at that point, the U of A took over the management of the medical school, and as a result, then included them in the budget, although the budget was never very big, and the medical school always faced medical crises because of the lack of financial resources available for it. So in the mid-1930s, as I mentioned, they did decide to build the new medical school right next to the city hospital. And so nice, substantial looking building, classrooms, laboratories were included in this building. And then they had access to the city hospital, which was right next door. And I think I have a picture of that. Yeah. So on my right, it should be your right as well. So you'll see the medical school building over here on the right. And then on the left, you can see the city hospital. And then in the middle, that building in the middle is the Isaac Folsom Clinic. And so the students would take their classes, have their laboratory work all in the medical school building on the right. And then they would work with patients in the outpatient clinic, the Isaac Folsom Clinic in the middle. And then they would also work with patients in the city hospital. The city hospital, both the city hospital and the Isaac Folsom Clinic, especially the Isaac Folsom Clinic, was particularly used for people who were unable to pay for medical care. And so that's where a lot of the poor indigent residents of Little Rock went to get their cares at the Isaac Folsom Clinic. The city hospital, although it was a nonprofit hospital, and it too had a lot of people who were unable to pay for medical care. But for the first time in its history, though, the medical school, when it moved to 12th and McAlmont Street in the mid-1930s for the first time, it really had sort of a campus medical center feel to it. Even though, you know, it's sort of a same situation as the second medical school had. You had the Isaac Folsom Clinic right there. You had a hospital right next to it. But the difference with this one in the 1930s is that the Logan Roots Hospital was sort of a private hospital. The city hospital was, of course, a public hospital. And so you really had the city supporting the hospital, and then you had the state supporting the medical school. And so you had the beginnings of a medical center campus there. So even by in the 40s, you know, it started out that they were outgrowing that. And with the medical school, they were always limited by the number of students that they could admit to the school because of the size of the school, the facilities that were available to students, of course, the clinical facilities that were available to them. And one of the things one of the constants throughout the medical school history, in addition to the inadequate financing and budgetary matters, was that whenever there was just not enough hospitals for the medical students really to do their training. And so when it came to medical students graduating and going to hospitals and doing the residency and things like that, most of the students ended up going out of state to other hospitals and not returning to Arkansas. And so the leaders of the medical
something's
school,
growing.
That corrosion will start to mound, it'll grow.
the leaders of the medical school thought that was
I'll get a rag and wipe that off in a minute. You'll be all good. That'll kill it.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, I think I got it. Oops, get you back there. Okay, so sorry, I got distracted. So they were already looking, you know, they wanted to keep these medical students in the state. They didn't want to train them and educate them and then have them go out of state and then just lose all this knowledge that they had given them. So that was a big thing. Also, they wanted, of course, they wanted a building that was big enough to accommodate more students. They wanted a hospital that was attached to the facility.
Wow, that works great.
And then they wanted
you just need the right tools. Yeah.
Sorry, someone has their audio on.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, I think I got it maybe. So in the early 1940s, they started thinking about building a new medical center. You know, they're always thinking about building a new medical center because they're always running out of space, right? So in the early 1940s, they start thinking about a new medical school, and they really want to do this medical campus center, medical center thing. And of course, one of the things, as I mentioned, that's been that was hampering the medical school throughout all of its years of existence was finances. So finally, in the mid-1940s, they were able to lobby the Arkansas legislature to give funding to the medical school. The legislature had always said that they thought the medical school was receiving too much money. It wasn't worth it. There were people who didn't really believe that Arkansas should have a medical school. So there was probably not antagonistic enemies against the medical school, but there were people who were not necessarily in favor of having a medical school. But beginning in the sort of the mid-1940s, the legislature started appropriating more and more money to the medical school. So in 1947, they passed an act to provide for the construction, equipping, and furnishing a hospital building at the University of Arkansas School of Medicine. So they started laying the foundation to build this new medical school. Of course, it would take years for it to happen, but beginning in 1947, they started laying the groundwork, and they provided the sort of the financial start of it. 1949, they start looking for architects. The Board of Trustees vote on a new hospital, new medical center. And so then they start looking for architects as to who would build or design the new medical center. And at this point, they're still not, they didn't know where it was going to go. Really, they didn't know anything about this new medical center, but they did name an architect, and they ended up with, they started out with Ray Burks, who worked for a local architectural firm. And he had designed, Burks had designed the McAlmont Medical School. And so, and he was hired to design the new medical school, the fifth one. At some point, they brought in Edward Durrell Stone, who was a native Arkansan, sort of becoming an internationally known architect. And Stone is the one who ended up designing the medical school, the one that is here now. Stone, he was a native of Fayetteville. He designed the Fine Arts Center at the U of A campus on Fayetteville in the early 1950s. So he was getting a reputation for this international style of architecture. Later, he would be recognized, become famous for his embassy in I think it was New Delhi, and then he also designed the Kennedy Center. So he became sort of an internationally famous architect, and he ended up designing, as I mentioned, the medical school here. Now, to get all this going, Governor Sid McMath became governor in 1949. One of his big pushes and one of his campaign promises was to build a medical center, a new medical center. And he really pushed that idea through the legislature. He was the one who got the money for the medical center, and he really was the one to be the main force behind getting a new medical center planned and built. So a lot of kudos have to go to Governor McMath and what he did. And the main thing that he did is in 1951, he persuaded the legislature to put a cigarette tax to tax cigarettes, and that tax that went on the cigarettes ended up being the money that was used to build the medical center. So while all the negotiations are happening about the money and everything, they start looking for a location in Little Rock as to where to build this new medical center. One of the things when they were talking, they had talked about and envisioned this medical center. And one of the things they envisioned as being on the medical center campus was the VA hospital. So you would have the VA hospital, you would have the medical school, you would have the university hospital went with it. And so you would have sort of this cluster of medical facilities all together where the students would have access to all of this to practice and to have clinical training and education and things like that. So a new VA hospital had been approved in 1945. And so medical university leaders and state leaders and city leaders thought that this might be a good opportunity to band together with the federal government and the VA hospital. The federal government had already chosen Roosevelt Road as the site for the new VA hospital. And university and city officials and state officials tried to convince them to not build on university or not build on Roosevelt, but to wait and see where the university would build the medical school and then build the VA on that site as well. The VA officials decided not to go that route. They went ahead and built the VA hospital on Roosevelt Road. The university did not want to go on Roosevelt Road, or there was not enough property there on Roosevelt Road. I'm not quite sure. But the VA hospital was built, and it was completed in 1948, long before the medical school. And that was probably because of finances, still trying to get finances to come up for the medical school. So the VA hospital is out of the picture now because it's built on Roosevelt Road. But city and state officials start looking for places in Little Rock to build the new medical school. At first, they thought they might stay downtown by the city park, where the fourth and the existing medical school was, but they determined that there was not enough room downtown for a medical school and medical campus to be built. So they started looking out west, and at that time, well, as it is today, the state hospital was out on West Markham. It's the circle that's on to the left of your screen. You can see the State Hospital for Nervous Diseases right there. And so they came up with a plan for the state to use part of the grounds of the state hospital to build the new medical school. And that turned out to be, everyone, I think, agreed with that. And so they got this land right next to the state hospital. And then the other circle that I have on the screen, the one on the right, that's approximately where the VA hospital was being built on Roosevelt. So you can see that they're not really that close at all, but you know anything about the VA hospital, you know that eventually when they built the new one, it did come into the proximity of the new medical school. So it ended up being coming into the campus anyway, albeit a few years later. So moving out west on Markham Street had a number of advantages. There was plenty of space. There was that extra land at the state hospital. But then people had also, the city had sort of started moving out towards that way. And St. Vincent Infirmary in 1954 moved from their location at 10th and High Street to the corner of University, what was then Hayes Street, Hayes and Markham. And so that was another reason why university and state officials felt like the West Markham location was good, because it was near the state hospital. So if the students needed to do any clinical psychiatry training or anything, they would have the state hospital there. There was plenty of land to build the campus. St. Vincent's was there nearby, so it was another opportunity for the students to participate in the hospital there. And just sort of they saw West Markham as sort of the burgeoning medical mile, if you will. So that was another advantage that they thought of West Markham, would be that there would sort of be this conglomeration of medical facilities out at the corner of West Markham and Hayes / University Avenue. So in 1951, they broke ground for the new medical center. 1951, as I mentioned, they had gotten the legislatures had passed the act to tax cigarettes, which would provide the financial impetus for the medical school. So they broke ground on West Markham. Picture, you have Governor Sid McMath, you have Dr. Lewis Webster Jones, who was the president of the University of Arkansas, and you had Dr. Hayden Nicholson, who was the dean of the medical school, on hand to break ground. And if you see in the very background, you can see a building, sort of the upper left. That is the state hospital back in the back. And then you can just see the cars parked on the hill behind them. So in the early 1950s, the medical center started becoming, the construction started. And Edward Durrell Stone, really, it was an interest. Of course, it was in an international architectural style. And the way he designed the hospital is it would have sort of a zigzag pattern. And you can't really see it from this picture, but it's kind of all the patient rooms would be on one side of the hallway, sort of in the zigzag pattern. Either they would be facing east or they would be facing north, the patient windows. And he did that, and before he designed all this, before he designed the plans for the building, he and a group of other individuals traveled around the country, and they visited other hospitals and see what worked at at other hospitals, what didn't work, and things like that. So they had the patient rooms all on one side of the hallway, thinking that that would be more efficient. And so, you would only have one side of the hallway that you would have to go on, basically, and then offices would be on the other side of the hallway. So that's how he designed it. And because of the financial situation, they had to design the building, or they had to complete the building in phases. The legislature, when it appropriated the money for the medical school, you couldn't use money. Everything had to be built at that one time. And so to do that, they didn't have enough money to build the whole thing. They wanted the educational wing, the hospital, things like that. So they had to do it in phases. And so phase one was the actual hospital, the medical center. And they were able to complete that one. And then they went on to the educational building right after that, when they got more money. So this is just while the building was under construction. It's the building is still here. It's changed dramatically over the years, but the building is still here. So in 1955, again, the legislature appropriated money. In this one, they actually appropriated money for not only construction, but also the operations budget of the medical school, which had been lacking in previous legislature. The legislation previously would only allocated for building the medical school, and did not provide any money for actually running of the medical school, which is a problem, if you can imagine. So they had these subsequent sessions, and where they added more money to the medical school. So 1956, the medical center itself opens. Ended up costing $12.9 million, a little bit more than what they wanted. But the hospital, for the first time, really, it had everything that the medical school officials wanted in the hospital. So for example, the basement, you had dining rooms, you had the emergency room. And so you can see the emergency room, the old emergency room, is right in the front. That low building right in the front is where the emergency room was. First floor, you had the outpatient clinic, you had the x-ray center, you had the School of Nursing. Second floor was operating rooms. Third floor were laboratories. Fourth floor was for labor and delivery. Fifth floor was for the premature nursery, mechanical equipment, isolation nursery. Sixth floor were student nurses' quarters and pediatrics. Seventh floor, psychiatry and neurology. And then the eighth floor was residents and interns' quarters. So medical center opens 1956. And as I mentioned, they used cigarette money. And so the paper gets cash out of smoke for a hospital. So, this article also talks about sort of the architectural style of Edward Durrell Stone. And he talks about the ledges. If you're familiar with the old hospital at all, it has these ledges that stick out. He called them eyebrows, and it was to allow sort of direct the light into the rooms and things that I'm not that familiar with, but apparently it worked for them. So 1957, the educational building rather was completed, and so all of the rest of the medical school moved from downtown over to Markham Street, and by 1957 they had completely left the McAlmont Street building and moved to the West Markham building. Now, the building at 12th and McAlmont that had originally housed the medical school, the old medical school, that was turned into offices for the U of A system for a little bit before it was abandoned. Here's just another view of the grounds when it first opened. So you have on the right those white buildings. That's the old state hospital. And then the building just directly across the street from the state hospital, that's the Shorey building. That's the educational building. And then you have the hospital, sort of that, you can see sort of the zigzag pattern in there. That's the hospital. And then the low building in front are the administrative offices for the hospital. And then you have the emergency room at the very front of the building. You have that little parking area right in the front. And you see the road coming up to it. That was the emergency room. So the building is all still here, most of it here. The courtyard and everything has been reconfigured just a little bit. And then, of course, in 2009, you had the new hospital, which was back here. And I'll show you a picture of that here in a minute of where that is. The sort of octopus looking building in the back, that is the Sheffield Infirmary. It was used part of the state hospital for TB patients, but then also outpatient clinics as well. So in 1959, they built the dormitory and the student union. And the dormitory, I think, was maybe 8 or 9 stories high. It was behind Shorey. And then the student union was a 1-story thing right in between Shorey and the dorm. So here's just another picture showing you the dorm on the right up there. That's the Jeff Banks dorm that was named after a professor of anatomy who died during the construction of the medical center. And so they named the student union after him, actually. The dormitories are right there. The dormitories were for both married and single. They had apartments for married couples, and then they had single dormitory rooms for single students. The low building right in front of the dormitory, that's the Jeff Banks Student Union. Really, really wonderful building. It's had a really nice and modern chandelier in it. It's really, really great looking building. And then you can also see a little bit more of the hospital and the Shorey building there, and you can see the Sheffield Infirmary back in the back. But this is 1964. A lot of things have changed since 1964, but the campus basically stayed the same until probably the mid 1970s when they started building new buildings on campus. Of course, they were building buildings all along, but the major construction really came along in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, and then into the 90s. So, but even though after the medical center was built, there was still a lot of sort of back and forth in the legislature about funding it. Funding was always an issue and is still an issue with the medical center. There's never enough money for running the medical center. There was a sort of a disagreement right after the medical school opened at the new place in the 1950s. Representative Paul Van Dalsum from Perry County, who you may know from his remark about keeping women barefoot and pregnant. He actually wanted to propose a bill in the legislature to separate the educational part of the medical school from the hospital part. And so where they would have different budgets. Basically create its own entity for the medical school, the educational part of it. And the University of Arkansas officials in Fayetteville were against that, of course, because at this time, the medical school is still part of UA Fayetteville, and it wouldn't be until 1975 that the medical school became its own entity. So that was sort of the fight that went on in the 1950s, 1960s about the leadership of the medical school and how, if it could grow, being under the auspices of U of A Fayetteville. Nicholson, who you saw at the groundbreaking, the photo, he and Caldwell, President Caldwell, who succeeded President Jones as president of the university, they butted heads. And so Nicholson ended up leaving the medical school to go out of state. But finally, after, from 1879 up to 1956, they finally, in 1956, the medical school finally had its own campus with its own hospital, its own educational facilities, and really being able to determine the best way to educate its students and to fulfill its need and its mission of producing doctors for Arkansas. So there's a lot more that goes into this story. I mean, I didn't go into the arguments between the medical school folks and the U of A folks and all the other stuff. This presentation was really about just moving the school from downtown to Markham Street. So I'm going to end it there. We have time for a few questions. If anyone has any questions, let me see. Someone has, when did segregation end? Segregation ended, 1948 was when Edith Irby Jones was admitted to medical school. Of course, 1948, they were still at the McAlmont location. She was admitted in 1948. There were still practices that were segregated. She had to eat in the dining room alone, a separate dining room. So integration didn't really fully happen at the medical school, I would say, until probably the mid-1960s. Have any other questions or anything? A comment, let's see. Sid McMath, thank you, Sid McMath. I agree with that. A bit foretelling that cigarette money not only went into construction of the old hospital, but that so many physicians at the time smoked. Person says, I remember a really smoky doctor's lounge off the emergency room. Yes. And it's also interesting to note that not only did a cigarette tax fund the medical school, the new medical school in the mid-1950s, the cigarette tax also funded the creation of the College of Public Health in like around 2007, 2008 here. And that's how the College of Public Health was founded. And it helped create the Educational 3 building here in on the UAMS campus, excuse me. Any other questions? The original student dorms, they were imploded, and thank you, Caroline, for bringing that up. I failed to mention that. So the dorms, you remember where the dorms were located, right behind, see if I can get this. So where the dorm is located, right there, behind Shorey, that was imploded in 2008, 2009, and that's where the new hospital was built. So the hospital now is where the old student dormitories were. And they took out the old student union as part of that implosion. And then on the bottom floor of the Shorey building, part of that, there was an auditorium, and that was taken away. That was taken in for the new hospital as well. A comment: are the older areas with historical markers? There are no historical markers on campus, unfortunately. And the building, the old hospital, what they call the central building now, has been remodeled so much. Unfortunately, it doesn't retain a lot of the features that Edward Durrell Stone originally planned for. Tobacco, you're right. Thank you for correcting me on that. Tobacco settlement money is what funded the College of Public Health, different from the cigarette tax. Yes, thank you for correcting me on that. Any other questions? Thank you all for being here. I hope you'll be here November 7th. Dr. Pruitt will be talking about Dr. Harry McDonald from Fort Smith. It'll be a great presentation. This presentation will be up on YouTube probably within a week. And appreciate you all being here. And we will look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you all.